Welcome to Provisional Aspirations, a podcast exploring the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and clinical mental health. I'm Thomas W. Moore, author, religious trauma survivor, and graduate student pursuing a master's degree in mental health counseling. Join me as I indulge my academic interest in the human spiritual experience, a curiosity that I couldn't fully explore as a member of a high-demand religious group. But now I'm learning out loud, and it feels great. Psychologist and researcher Allan Schore is a lover, but he not only reminds us of the softer side of the healing arts, but elevates his discussion with evidence from the hard neuroscience of the brain. Schore's Right Brain Psychotherapy and associated regulation theory contribute to psychotherapy's efforts to prove and improve itself and go beyond the mechanical, cognitive-based therapeutic modalities to include creative intuition, maternal warmth, and interpersonal healing. If you've had the experience of truly connecting with a therapist, or as a therapist with your client, you will resonate with Schore's materialist explanation of this very connectivity, the uncanny experience of one-mindedness that occurs between client and therapist. And if you've ever experienced long-term healing resulting from the honesty and vulnerability of a supportive human in any context, you will no doubt appreciate Schore's explanation of the neurobiology that supports this interpersonal phenomenon. Over the past few decades, psychotherapy has fought to be included in evidence-based clinical practice, backed by the medical and scientific community. As a result, psychotherapy has been elevated beyond just the spiritual care of an individual in distress to a legitimate part of the health and wellness routine of the modern secularist. Paradoxically, modern intellectual trends away from the wiggishness of the scientific method could reduce the necessity for legitimizing the healing arts. But at the moment, many still feel comforted by the paternalistic protection of the medico-scientific institution and its efforts to delineate evidence-based approaches from the mystical, spiritual, and religious. The statement that a psychotherapeutic modality is evidence-based often speaks to the clinical effectiveness of a practice, as evidenced by subjective self-report measures of improved psychological well-being or interpersonal and social functioning. That is to say that the research suggests that an evidence-based approach actually makes people feel better. This contributes to the secular-minded client's willingness to be vulnerable with a clinical practitioner and open them up to their inner world. Formalizing therapeutic modalities also provides a framework for educating them in licensed practitioners. Of course, before the era of Western science and the medical establishment's requirement of providing proof of efficacy, interpersonal healing practices found their place in society, in the form of religious rites, meditative practices, supernatural and mystical ceremonies, and the application of mind-altering natural substances. However, for the materialist, who seeks to understand not only that a psychotherapeutic modality works, but also how it is effective at the organismic level, a clinical evidence base only goes so far. It may suffice for the medical community and the layperson who needs to be reassured that a mode of psychological treatment works. But from the biological and neuroscientific perspective, asserting that a modality is clinically effective does little to explain the biological basis for the efficacy of treatment. Enter the neuroscience of psychotherapy. Much of my writing in this space attempts to explore how we can harden up psychotherapy to understand more thoroughly what happens to the brain and body as healing occurs. This starts with understanding what happens to the brain in psychopathology, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorders, delusions, troublesome ideation, etc. Then understanding what occurs when these disorders are resolved, and finally, how these neurological mechanisms can be operationalized by psychotherapists. A clearer understanding of how a clinician's interactions with a client impact their brain, not only holistically, but with dialectical and neurological specificity, will allow us to create therapeutic modalities that target both the global neurobiological markers of a diagnosed disorder and their constituent components at the electrical and chemical level. In sum, as the evidence base for psychotherapy moves beyond the clinical to the neuroscientific, it could take a metaphysical jump from the treatment of the mind to the treatment of the brain, and mature into the targeted treatment of specific neurobiological regions, processes, and wounds. Allan Schore's unique brand of neuroscience-based psychoanalysis provides a piece of the puzzle in understanding the connection between talk therapy and brain changes. Allan Schore is a psychoanalysis. As I mentioned in my previous article about Canadian neuroscientist George Northoff, psychoanalysis is more than an outdated therapeutic modality crumbling under the scrutiny of modern social politics, as it is often made out to be. Psychoanalysis is a sophisticated conceptual approach to understanding the dynamic human mind, elements of which can be used as a commensurate language to connect psychology and the material of the brain. Schore's work connects interpersonal mechanisms from psychoanalysis with neuroscientific findings about neurobiological processes within the right hemisphere of the brain. But is there a difference between the right and left brain? Let's face it, popular neuroscience confuses us about the bilaterality of the brain. On the one hand, we're told not to peg folks as right or left brainers, and that the situation is far more nuanced. At the same time, research indicates that bilateral shifts of hemispheric dominance in the brain can occur, and that specific cognitive components of consciousness can be located within the right or left hemisphere. Schore is not alone in asserting that imbalances in hemispheric activity can result in psychological disorders. For example, what is often referred to as negative affect, sadness, guilt, fear, and depression, is seated in the right brain. Additionally, linguistic processes, intellectual cognition, and perception of social propriety occur more dominantly in the left brain. As a result, conclusions can be drawn about the necessity to increase interhemispheric neuroplasticity in the brains of individuals with intense bipolar experiences, extremes of positively valenced intellectual thought, and extremes of depressive emotion, such that moderation can occur between the two modes of cognition. So I'm requesting that you suspend your criticism of hemispheric differences in the brain to follow the theoretical line of thought that supports Schore's right brain psychotherapy. Significantly, Schore suggests that neural restructuring in the right brain can bring improvements in mental wellness, not only in the short term, but also that such restructuring can have a compounding effect over time, as if the kernel of psychotherapeutic repair can spiral outward into future iterations of neurobiological and psychological development across the lifespan. This claim could shift the mental health field's perspective considerably. Treating human suffering would no longer be a matter of altering brain chemistry with psychoactive compounds, as in psychopharmacology, nor of teaching people better ways of thinking, like in cognitive therapy, such as CBT, but of using the therapist's brain to effect a neurobiological restructuring in the client's brain, such that a cascade of events occur that perpetuate healthful neurological development even after therapy has concluded. Let's dig in. The following provides some key concepts from right brain psychotherapy and regulation theory, and how they help us understand the brain and the healing process. By the way, regulation theory is the conceptual framework upon which Schore bases his psychotherapeutic modality. It encompasses the idea that when right brain synchrony occurs between client and therapist, the therapist's brain becomes an extension of the regulatory apparatus of the client's brain, when the latter is overcome by intense affect. The clinician's ability to regulate affect in the therapeutic chamber creates an environment wherein the client's brain can strengthen its ability to regulate emotional overwhelm unilaterally. The first key theme is mutual regressions in the service of the self. Regression is a psychoanalytic term that refers to an individual's reverting to an earlier form of psychological functioning. Regression can be pathological, like when an individual under extreme stress begins acting in a way that is not developmentally appropriate for the interpersonal situation. Or it can be healthy, like when you cast off your social inhibitions when appropriate, such as in play, when you dance like a child at a party, act like a hooligan at a sporting arena, or laugh at crude humor in a comedy club, also during sex. And then you return unscathed to your normal form of developmentally appropriate social functioning. In psychoanalysis, regression is operationalized. In the confidentiality of the therapy room, an individual can regress to an immature state, be brought back delicately to the present by the clinician, and then go about their day as normal, with new insights about themselves. This process allows a reintegration of the earlier states of functioning that were repressed from consciousness. So then what makes it a mutual regression? Essentially, the trained therapist, through the process of transference and countertransference, regresses with the client. They can go there and come back with the client. The therapist's brain has mastered the neurobiological art of regressing into right brain affective intensity and then returning to a regulated state. This requires that the therapist's brain is organismically developed and can maintain intense affective states without becoming overwhelmed or resorting to defense mechanisms, not even those provided by their professional clinical persona or the technicalities of their modality. The mature therapist knows their traumatic trigger points. They can tolerate intense emotional states within themselves, surrender control of the room to the emotional intensity of the client, and then bring it all back to regulation. The second key theme is right brain synchronicity and the interpersonal subjective field. If the client and therapist regress successfully, they enter a state of right brain synchronicity. From the perspective of the therapist, this is a flow-like state, outside of phenomenological consciousness. Research from fMRI scans shows that in these therapeutically aligned moments, the hemispheric domination of the brain changes in both client and therapist. The left brain, with its propensity for categorizing and differentiating, essentially goes offline, and a dyadic subjective field is created. Both brains are right brain dominated at this moment. It should be noted that while simultaneous right brain dominance can be seen clearly in an fMRI during this phenomenon, no hard science is provided as evidence of a shared subjectivity that occurs between the client and therapist, outside of clinical reports. It appears that we may not yet possess the technology, or perhaps have not asked the right questions of our brain scanners yet to demonstrate this. Experienced therapists relate to the felt experience of this phenomenon and may even use psychological mechanisms of their own to enter this state when performing their work. But in right brain psychotherapy, Schore doesn't explain how a clinician can affect this neurological state. Here's what Schore says about right brain synchronicity in the therapy room, and I quote, "The psychobiologically attuned, intuitive clinician tracks the nonverbal, moment-to-moment rhythmic structures of the patient's internal states and is flexibly and fluidly modifying his or her own behavior to synchronize with that structure, thereby co-creating with the client a growth-facilitating context for the organization of the therapeutic alliance." Schore acknowledges that there could be a disruption in the right brain synchronicity if therapeutic trust is broken. If this occurs, the cyclical rupture and repair of synchronicity between client and therapist corresponds to pivotal moments of neurological reorganization and synaptic restructuring. The third key theme is increased affect tolerance and regulation. There's something about the term regulation theory that is off-putting. I get the same tummy twitch when I read about William Glasser's control theory. Perhaps it's the all-too-common fear that the therapist is an extension of a regulatory mechanism of the social infrastructure, a position that I fear some counselors actually absorb into their professional self-concept at times, particularly when treating minors. Clients must feel safe in the therapy room, not under threat of forced behavioral modification. Additionally, emotional regulation is often required in interpersonal dynamics of oppression, as in employment situations or authoritarian situations like at school, even to the extent that authentic experience becomes repressed from consciousness. But this is not that. Regulation theory is not a behaviorist mechanism to teach self-control and conformity. In fact, Schore differentiates between two forms of self-control. The first, more traditional sense, involves higher cognitive left brain processes. As in situations of enforced compliance, mechanics of authority and power are used to encourage behaviors that in time may alter the attitudes that underpin them. A benign example of this would be an individual's begrudgingly following the directive to exercise 3 times a week, only to find out 2 months later that they actually enjoy it. Again, this is not that. Regulation theory is about training the brain to regulate intense emotional experiences. Previously denied emotional content finds space in the intersubjective field facilitated by the therapist, such that the client develops the ability to tolerate ever-increasing intensity of emotional experience. The client develops their own adaptive psychological processes to regulate their emotional experience, both in isolation and interpersonally, by leveraging a trusted relationship to assist in the regulation of emotion. The therapist mimics a mother's work. As an infant develops, it gradually experiences heightened levels of excitement, sadness, anger, and fear, and returns each time to the safety of the mother. Each time the child returns to the mother, right brains resynchronize between the mother and the child, and the child eventually develops the neurological mechanisms to tolerate the ever-increasing levels of emotional intensity that they face in their life. In healthy development, this results in a well-developed sense of self and resiliency, in contrast to a highly restricted self that relies heavily on socially maladaptive defense mechanisms that disallow emotional experience. At its mildest, maladaptive regulation manifests as an individual lacking emotional awareness. At its worst, it becomes a diagnosable personality disorder. In a sense, the therapist facilitates the maternal titration of negative affect in the client and the healthy development of the regulation process. The goal of right brain psychotherapy is to create a growth-facilitating relational environment that stimulates plasticity in the cortical and subcortical regions of the brain. At the neurochemical level, this relational state is marked by increased levels of oxytocin, as would be in the case of the mother-child dyad. By recreating the optimal environment for neurogenesis in the therapy room, the therapist can assist the client in changing their brain, in a very material sense, repairing traumatic disruptions in interpersonal attachment and their neural correlates in the physical structure of the brain. Allan Schore takes the psychoanalysts, and by extension the attachment theorists, approach to defining love. A mother's love has long been praised by the poets. Conversely, there's no greater act of violence than a mother's neglect. The absence of maternal bonding has been linked to psychological distress in adulthood, a reminder of the importance of maternal bonding and attachment in the crucial years of infant brain development for long-term emotional regulation and well-being across the lifespan. Schore describes maternal love of the infant as the expansion and tolerance of two positively valenced emotions, quiet love and excitatory love. The mother enables the child's brain to gradually increase its ability to regulate itself in the face of excitation. Excitation, although usually considered pleasant, can lead to overwhelm if not regulated. This is the case in the positively valenced excitatory nature of mania. When an infant's brain is overwhelmed by excitement, it's brought back to the safety of quiet love by the mother. The mother intuitively performs this regulatory dance of positive affect in her dealings with the child, with corresponding development in the child's brain. The use of love in the therapy room can be framed along these lines, absent the erotic power dynamics of the left brain. This aligns with the Rogerian approach to counseling that prescribes universal positive regard for the client. Like the good enough mother's unequivocal love and unquestionable loyalty to her child, the therapist remains warm and accepting of the client, regardless of any emotional outbursts or emotion-laden language from the client. The rupture and maintenance of the therapeutic bond mimic the exploration and return of the child to the mother's universal acceptance, and allow the client to enhance their psychological maturity and neurobiological health over time. Schore feels that too much emphasis has been placed on left hemisphere cognitive-dominated modalities. I agree. I would add to Schore's thesis that emphasis has been placed in recent years on postmodern, post-structural, and feminist modalities that emphasize power dynamics in the relationships and how they interact with psychological functioning at the individual level. These theories leverage linguistics and cognition over real-time interactive emotional dynamics, as in right brain psychotherapy. Although the over-analysis of attachment styles in the therapy room is common today, these are usually discussed conceptually, with very little acknowledgement by the therapist of their role in actually healing relational trauma at the organismic level. Schore argues that right brain-focused therapy is superior because of its focus on the neurological healing of attachment wounds. As a result, change occurs even after therapy concludes, in a sort of future-forward cycle of neurological growth. Schore contrasts this to cognitive therapies, the downward causality of which must be reinforced regularly so that relapse into old behaviors and modes of thinking does not occur. This is a compelling argument for the superiority of right brain neuropsychoanalysis, although I haven't yet seen any neuroscientific research to support this claim. Schore loses me a bit in the final chapters of right brain psychotherapy. Schore goes so far as to extrapolate his ideology of right brain superiority to the sociopolitical arena. It appears to be a tendency of science writers who become excited about new potentials for healing to leap from the individual to the collective level. For example, in my readings of The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate and On Becoming a Person by the great Carl Rogers, I noticed both authors fall into the trap of attempting to extend their clinical theories to the social sphere. Schore bemoans a dearth of right hemisphere dominance in our current sociopolitical environment. But this, what the world needs now is right brain dominance, sweet right brain dominance, feels altogether too reductive. Therapists tend to forget that their role is inherently one of conflict with higher strata of socioecology. Society at large, its oppressive infrastructures, hegemonic ideologies, and restrictive norms, are the very elements of the collective social ecology that rub up against an individual's unique sense of self, such that psychological distress occurs. It's short-sighted for therapeutic practitioners to believe that their art could contribute to any permanent social change. If such a change were to occur, the therapist would soon find their approach ineffective, as it would thereafter, post-revolution, reinforce the very community values that would have by that time become oppressive at the individual level. In the case of hemispheric therapies, if the world became more right-dominated, therapists might need to switch to the cognitive left brain modes of healing to bring a balance in the force. Perhaps it would be more modest to focus on neuroplasticity across both hemispheres of the brain. The therapist may need to use a bihemispheric approach to therapy, leveraging not only the intersubjective field of Schore's right brain therapy, but also cognitively focused therapies that harness the strength of the left hemisphere processes. Just as right brain psychotherapy increases the client's tolerance for affective intensity, could there be a left hemispheric intersubjective field that would increase intellectual, cognitive, and linguistic capabilities, with application to interpersonal gameplay and power dynamics? If this were the case, a psychologically mature individual would experience developmentally appropriate extremes of right and left brain cognition, complemented with regulatory abilities in the contrasting hemisphere. Psychobiological health would correlate to neuroplasticity across the corpus callosum in an alternating right-to-left shift in hemispheric dominance, balanced by a simultaneous suspension of the contrasting mode of processing in the opposite hemisphere. Neuronal activity would move fluidly across brain hemispheres like the waves of the yin-yang, never losing the dot of contrast at their center that regulates each wave, moderating it, and returning it back upon itself. Thanks for listening to Provisional Aspirations. I was definitely inspired by my reading of Allan Schore's Right Brain Psychotherapy. I hope you found it interesting too. Please tune in next time, leave me some comments, and I'll catch you next time on Provisional Aspirations.